Greetings and salutations, everyone. My name is Andrew Kirchhoff, and welcome to my YouTube channel. Today, I'm going to be talking about my Week 9 hidden gems for the 2023 fantasy football season. Over the course of today's episode, I'm going to be talking about players at a variety of different positions, players who I consider to be hidden gems across the entire fantasy football landscape and universe, while you may consider them to be sleeper options, players who are currently starting in less than 30% of leagues that can absolutely be picked up and played, not only to deal with the bye weeks and injuries you have, but of course help you potentially capture a victory in Week 9. So over the course of today's video, I'll mention these players, share with you guys my thought process and opinions on each individual player, while also going ahead and presenting statistics in order to justify the reasons why I believe they're hidden gems and potential starting options going into Week 9. Before we get into today's content, a couple reminders. Tomorrow afternoon, 1 p.m. to 3 p.m. Pacific Standard Time, I'll be live streaming here on the channel, again, answering questions, starter set questions. On Sunday morning, I'll also be here from 6 a.m. to 10 a.m. Pacific Standard Time, a 4-hour live stream, primarily because there is an early Germany game at 6:30 between the Miami Dolphins and Kansas City Chiefs. So we'll be live streaming for 4 hours, answering your questions. Be sure to swing on by to get your questions answered. Now, for those of you guys who want to get my rankings without having to wake up so early on Sunday morning, be sure to go ahead, travel down to the description of the video and check out Underdog Fantasy. At the end of today's video, I'll be putting together a couple pick'em slips with the help of Underdog Fantasy. But if you go ahead and sign up today using code Andrew and make a first-time deposit minimum of $10, not only are you going to get the first-time deposit match up to $500, but you're going to get my rankings sent to you every single Sunday morning for the remainder of the season. These rankings are by position, by tier, half PPR, full PPR, flex rankings, all-encompassing rankings, so that regardless of what you're doing on Sunday mornings, you have my rankings and an advantage upon your league mates. Take advantage of the opportunity on hand. Again, check out the map to the right side of the screen to determine your eligibility based on your current location. And if in fact you sign up before Sunday's slate of games, you can also take advantage of the new customer special of Lamar Jackson 0.5 total yards. Thank you for using code Andrew. The support is greatly appreciated. Now let's go ahead and begin by talking about some hidden gems, beginning with the first player I wanted to mention, the Soul Stone of this week. It is Demario Douglas. As we all know, the Soul Stone requires a sacrifice. And in this circumstance, the sacrifice comes in the form of Kendrick Bourne, a player that as of late was on fire. 3 consecutive games of a receiving touchdown, but unfortunately, he sustained a season-ending injury last week. Another player that will be missing in this lineup, Devontae Parker, sustained a concussion. So with the primary number 1 and number 2 receiving options of the New England Patriots offense no longer there for this upcoming week, the expectation is that Demario Douglas, who's currently only being started in 15% of leagues, has incredibly high upside, especially considering the matchup on hand. But in the last 2 games, we have begun to see Demario Douglas slowly but surely take over the slot role within this offense. In the last 2 games, has had himself 13 total targets. In one game, 9.4 fantasy points. In the other, 5.4 fantasy points. In order to garner those 13 targets, he's ran 52 routes, which is a 25% target rate. Overall, incredible numbers thus far as of late, especially considering he has taken over the slot receiving role from Juju Smith-Schuster, who was the primary guy earlier on in the year. So as of late, we have seen Demario Douglas playing 84% of his overall snaps from the slot position, and going into this upcoming weekend's matchup should be able to find success, especially considering the slot receiving options thus far this season on a per game average for the New England Patriots are averaging 7.6 targets, 4.5 receptions, 37.5 receiving yards, 0.83 receiving touchdowns per game on average. That's 8.25 fantasy points per game over the course of this season. So my expectation is with Demario Douglas primarily as a slot receiving option and no other receiving options on the outside besides guys like Jalen Reagor potentially, vying for his own targets, which again, we're not expecting much out of him. The ball should be going in the direction of Demario Douglas very often on Sunday, especially like I mentioned earlier, when we take into account this upcoming matchup. The Washington Commanders defense are literally the second best matchup at the wide receiver position. They're allowing 35.55 half PPR fantasy points per game in terms of receiving statistics isolated. That's receptions, receiving yards, and receiving touchdowns. Now, in the last couple weeks, we have seen Demario Douglas get himself a couple opportunities on the ground. He has had himself 2 rushing attempts for 24 yards in the last 2 games. So at least he's getting himself more opportunity there. But going forward, it is a very advantageous matchup, a matchup in which the Washington Commanders on a consistent weekly basis have given up big plays to opposing wide receivers. Amongst all New England Patriots wide receivers thus far this season, Kendrick Bourne leads all in terms of deep passing targets down the field. But the second option in that category, Demario Douglas. So the expectation is with Kendrick Bourne out, they're going to utilize Demario Douglas in that overall capacity besides a slot receiving option, a deep downfield option considering his 4.44 40-yard dash speed. Now, in order to set up plays down the field, you'll often need to give your quarterback an ample volume of time. And luckily for Mac Jones this week, the Washington Commanders defensive line is in shambles. They just traded away Young and Sweat. Those two are their primary pass rushers. I mean, Young has 6 sacks and Sweat has 5.5 sacks. No one is even close to those two on the roster, and now they're gone. So if we're going to be in a position in which Mac Jones will have time in the pocket, of course, you'll be able to find Demario Douglas on a consistent basis and, of course, potentially find even more upside than when many are anticipating going into the given week based on the sacrifice of the Soul Stone. Let's move on to our reality stone, because the reality of the situation is that the Dallas Cowboys have a very competitive matchup taking on the Philadelphia Eagles this week. And in fact, this Philadelphia Eagles matchup is the best matchup at the wide receiver position thus far this season, as they're allowing 36.71 fantasy points per game to opposing wide receivers. A ridiculous statistic to say the very least, but nonetheless, we're going to go ahead and take advantage of this overall opportunity. Brandin Cooks is a player that in the last 2 games has slowly but surely been more relevant for fantasy purposes, primarily because he is finding himself in the end zone. The last 2 contests, 13 fantasy points and 12.7 fantasy points in a half PPR scoring format. Now, when you look at this matchup overall, yes, CeeDee Lamb is going to get himself his utilization. When we go ahead and look at the overall yardage allowed to number 1 wide receivers against the Philadelphia Eagles thus far this season on average, that's 91.4 yards. Number 2 wide receivers and number 3 wide receivers against the Philadelphia Eagles, typically averaging 51.3 yards and 56.1 yards. So my expectation is, of course, Brandin Cooks as the number 2/number 3 receiving option within this offense is going to get himself yardage. Now, whether you do anticipate to see Michael Gallup or Brandin Cooks as the number 2, what we know for certain is that since week 3, in 4 of the last 5 games, Brandin Cooks has outsnapped Michael Gallup within this offense. So I anticipate him being the number 2 receiving option. And even Jalen Tolbert was taking away a couple offensive opportunities from Michael Gallup last week. So as long as we continue to see Brandin Cooks is the number 2 receiving option within this offense in a high-scoring event as anticipated against the best wide receiver matchup going into the week, and everyone's paying so much attention to trying to shut down CeeDee Lamb, of course, Brandin Cooks on the opposite side of the field should be able to find success. He's a wide receiver who's currently being started in only 17% of leagues. And even though thus far this season, he has only gotten himself 4 targets in 5 of the 6 games he has participated in, we have to put into perspective the majority of the games that the Dallas Cowboys have played this season have been blowouts in which their defense is scoring points. Their offense is just pretty much trying to kill clock and get out of there. So there hasn't been as much need for upside from these receiving options. So my expectation is going into this week, Brandin Cooks, a little bit more upside in a higher scoring event. All right, let's move on to the next hidden gem. We have the Power Stone, and the power back of this week is Chuba Hubbard. Now, for those of you who recall, back in week 6, I did have Chuba Hubbard as a hidden gem. So we're bringing him back. But back in week 6 against the Miami Dolphins, in the absence of Miles Sanders, had himself a monster performance. I think it was over 80 rushing yards and a rushing touchdown, a great overall game for fantasy purposes, especially in the relief of the running back, who was the primary starter, no longer being in that conversation due to an injury. But going into this upcoming week, the expectation is once again that Chuba Hubbard is going to be the starter, not because Miles Sanders is inactive, but rather like we saw last week, and like I mentioned last Sunday morning throughout our live stream, everything that Frank Reich said in week 8 was leading towards Chuba Hubbard being the starting running back. He wouldn't answer the question as to whether or not one or the other running back was going to be the primary starter, because they didn't want to go ahead and tell the public that, yes, we're going to transition to Chuba Hubbard as a starting back. And that's exactly what they demonstrated against the Houston Texans. 15 rushing attempts, 2 targets, 2 receptions, 17 overall opportunities and touches for Chuba Hubbard against that defense. Played 67% of the overall offensive snaps. While on the other end of this conversation, Miles Sanders played 18% of the offensive snaps, had 2 total touches, and 0 total yards. That in itself obviously leads to Chuba Hubbard being the starting running back and lead back of this team going forward. And we got even more confirmation of that earlier today, as Frank Reich literally said during a press conference, Chuba Hubbard is going to be the starter. Quote for quote, that's exactly what he said. So the expectation is that, of course, he'll continue to get the bulk majority of the overall opportunities within this backfield. And especially considering Miles Sanders was already designated on the injury report earlier this week. He was designated with a calf injury. They may want to go ahead and, once again, not utilize him to a high capacity. And if that, in fact, is going to be the case, going into the matchup this week against the Indianapolis Colts is one of the easiest. In fact, it's the 4th best matchup at the position. The Colts are allowing 17.63 fantasy points per game in terms of rushing statistics isolated. That's rushing yards and rushing touchdowns. That has nothing to do with the receiving upside, which we all know Chuba Hubbard is absolutely capable of handling within this offense. Now, one of the biggest advantages for Chuba Hubbard this upcoming week is the fact that over the course of this entire season, the Indianapolis Colts, they've given up their fair share of touchdowns to opposing running backs. They're tied with the Denver Broncos in terms of the most touchdowns allowed to opposing running backs in terms of rushing touchdowns, 11 thus far this season. If we just look at the last 5 games the Indianapolis Colts have played, running backs against this team, just putting this into perspective, Alvin Kamara, 17 carries, 59 yards and a touchdown. Kareem Hunt, 10 carries, 31, 2 touchdowns. Jerome Ford in that same game, 11 carries, 74 and a touchdown. Travis Etienne, 18 carries, 55, 2 touchdowns. Tyjae Spears, 7 carries, 34 and a touchdown. Kyron Williams, 25 for 103 and 2 touchdowns. The Colts defense has literally allowed 9 rushing touchdowns in the last 5 games to opposing running backs. My expectation is that Chuba Hubbard finds himself in the end zone, currently only starting in 25% of leagues. He should be in your lineups going into this upcoming weekend's matchups. Moving on to the Space Stone, we have Jahan Dotson of the Washington Commanders. He's going to slowly but surely find himself a space within this offense. And that's kind of what we've begun to see over the last couple of weeks. Now, when we go back to 2022 and just look at what Jahan Dotson was capable of accomplishing, and the reason why we all drafted him so highly this season was the expectation is that he'd take another step in his sophomore campaign. But unfortunately, that hasn't been the case. I mean, in comparison to year 1, from weeks 1 through 4 of year 1, 5.5 targets per game, but was still averaging 11.55 half PPR fantasy points per game. After he came back from injury and found his footing, from weeks 13 through 18 of his rookie season 2022, 7 targets per game, more opportunity, and also averaging more fantasy points per game, 12.58 in a half PPR scoring format. So the expectation this offseason was Jahan Dotson would take another step forward. But unfortunately, similar to Terry McLaurin, this offense really didn't get much utilization out of these wide receivers early on in the year. Like Terry McLaurin from weeks 1 through 3 was only averaging 8.37 fantasy points per game. Jahan Dotson was only averaging 4.43 fantasy points per game. Now, as of late, we've seen a jump in terms of their overall contributions. You go to weeks 4 through 8, Terry McLaurin averaging nearly 13 fantasy points per game. And we're talking about Jahan Dotson from weeks 4 through 8, nearly averaging 9 fantasy points per game. So, of course, a huge jump there in terms of total opportunity and total fantasy points. So my expectation going into this week, considering Jahan Dotson has garnered 18 total targets in the last 2 games, he's beginning to play far more of his overall snaps from the slot position. I mean, just watching back the game between the Philadelphia Eagles and Washington Commanders, they're using him in the slot position, running a lot of quick slants, getting the ball out of Sam Howell's hands as quickly as possible. Of course, he's the most sacked quarterback in the National Football League. They're setting up an offense to go ahead and keep a guy like Sam Howell clean, protected, and then get the ball out of his hands very quickly to a talented receiver like Jahan Dotson so that he can make plays. Now, going into this week, they take on the New England Patriots defense. That defense typically likes to shut down the number 1 option of the opposing offense. Now, this upcoming week, the expectation would be that Terry McLaurin would be that number 1 guy that they're going to try to shut down. And when I went ahead and looked at the overall history of this season, besides Tyreek Hill last week having a monster game alongside of Jalen Waddle, we have seen number 1 wide receivers have less than perfect games against the New England Patriots thus far this season. I mean, Stephon Diggs, 6 catches, 58 and a touchdown. He was great for fantasy purposes, but that's not a signature Stephon Diggs game. Devontae Adams, 2 catches for 29. That's it. Chris Olave, 2 catches for 12 and a touchdown. CeeDee Lamb, 4 catches for 36 and a touchdown. Sure, they're scoring touchdowns. That's fine. And we'll love to see that out of Terry McLaurin. But in terms of reception counts and total receiving yards, not great numbers overall. Lastly, the New York Jets wide receiver, Garrett Wilson, 5 catches for 48. So my expectation, going up against the defense that's middle of the pack in terms of fantasy points per game allowed, 28.81 in terms of allowing fantasy points to opposing wide receivers thus far this season on average. If we're going to be in the middle of the pack, this is going to be a game that should be back and forth scoring. My expectation would be that the number 2 wide receiver option, with the absence of Curtis Samuel, Jahan Dotson should see far more target options, gets more snaps in the slot position, should be a fantastic play within the given week. Moving on to the time stone, we have CJ Stroud. I wanted to go ahead and use the time stone in order to kind of rewind us a little bit to last week. Last week, and which we'll go over in just a moment in terms of how the plays overall went, I talked about Tank Dell and Dameon Pierce. Both those options were complete duds. They're still hidden to this day in terms of hidden gems. Going into this week, I wanted to mention CJ Stroud. He's currently starting in 42% of leagues, but what I wanted to go ahead and do is talk about a quarterback, primarily because many of us are going to be missing the services of Kirk Cousins, Matthew Stafford, maybe Deshaun Watson, Josh Dobbs, Justin Fields, Jared Goff, Brock Purdy, Trevor Lawrence. There are so many quarterbacks, whether it's bye weeks, injuries, that are going to be missing within the given overall week. Therefore, CJ Stroud, in my mind, presents an opportunity as a hidden gem, someone who hasn't played well over the course of the last 3 games to have potential upside. Specifically, in the last 3 games, only averaging 13.74 fantasy points per game, while averaging 28 passing attempts per game. Not a great overall number, but as of late, hasn't been great. But early on in the season, when they allowed him to throw the ball 36 times per game, he was averaging 21.3 fantasy points per game in a 4-point per passing touchdown format. My expectation is that going into this upcoming week, with Robert Woods out again and Dameon Pierce out this upcoming week, there's going to be less of an opportunity to run the ball. And taking on the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, who have been great in terms of stopping the run against opposing offenses over the course of the last couple seasons, my expectation is a high volume of potential passing opportunities for CJ Stroud. When he takes on a defense that is giving up the 15th most fantasy points in terms of passing statistics alone, 13.42 per game to opposing quarterbacks, I think there's going to be even more upside, primarily because when we look at the quarterbacks that have taken on the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, if in fact Desmond Ridder didn't fumble the ball 3 times against the Tampa Bay Buccaneers in week 7, we would have seen 5 different quarterbacks in the last 7 games put up 16 or more fantasy points against this Tampa Bay Buccaneers defense. There is an opportunity to take advantage of the matchup, considering Dameon Pierce is out. And this offense has not consistently been able to run the ball, whether it's even with Devin Singletary. My expectation should be that CJ Stroud airs it out for the entirety of this game and hopefully can get himself somewhere close to 40 passing attempts in order to get him back into the relevant quarterback conversation. That's my expectation, purely based on game script, the lack of running opportunities within this offense, and their primary starting running back being out, and a matchup in which they'll probably have to keep up with the Tampa Bay Buccaneers offense for majority of the time. All right, moving on to the final stone. We have the Mind Stone and the Arizona Cardinals defense. In my home fantasy football league, half PPR, super flex, I'm currently first place. What would you expect? In my home league, my brother, second place. He's a 2-time champ in this entire league. As of late, has really started to pick up a little bit of momentum in terms of picking defenses on a weekly basis. Now, you may be wondering, okay, the Arizona Cardinals defense, a defense that's currently only being started in 1% of leagues, why would we want to start them against the Cleveland Browns? Well, let me give you a narrative. Going back to week 4, my brother played the Pittsburgh Steelers defense. They were being started in 74% of leagues in that week. They got -1 points against the Houston Texans. The following week, he was like, all right, I'm not playing the Steelers anymore. I can't trust them. Let's go ahead and let's play the Washington Commanders. They were starting 60% of leagues that week, Thursday Night Football. They scored -1 points on Thursday night against the Chicago Bears. So then he said, you know what? I'm done with these defenses. I'm just going to start spinning a random wheel of all the defenses that are available in our league and just spin the wheel 3 times, get 3 individual winners. After getting those 3 teams, he spins it one more time. And of course, he finds his defense for the week. In week 6, it landed on the Los Angeles Chargers. They took on the Dallas Cowboys. They were started in 2% of leagues that week, and they scored 8 fantasy points. Pretty solid overall play comparatively to the -1. Then the following week, week 7, 3% started the Chicago Bears defense, 17 fantasy points. Then the following week, again, randomizes it, 5% started the New York Giants defense against the Jets, 12 fantasy points. This week, randomized it, landed on the Arizona Cardinals. They take on the Cleveland Browns. If PJ Walker is going to be the starter, if Deshaun Watson is going to be the starter, we're expecting some interceptions. And honestly, I'm expecting this random wheel test to potentially, kind of turn out another great defensive play within the given week, considering we're on a little bit of a hot streak here. So my expectation, using the Mind Stone and just running with the random wheel that my brother utilizes, I'm going to go ahead and suggest the Arizona Cardinals. That covers it in terms of my hidden gems for this week. I wanted to also go ahead and review last week's hidden gems just to kind of give you guys a little bit of clarity. Last week we had Tank Dell. He absolutely did nothing. He was wide receiver 73. That was brutal. Curtis Samuel got injured in the game. So I guess, that sucked, but it happens. He had 4 targets and 4 receptions within the first 14 routes that he ran. So he was getting himself a lot of opportunity. In his absence, of course, Jamison Crowder balled out, had himself over, 17 fantasy points. So Curtis Samuel would have been a great play, but unfortunately got injured. Dameon Pierce was another one of these dud players. Again, we're going back to the well of the Houston Texans this week, but it was just purely a matter of the fact that the fullback stole a touchdown, and on another opportunity later on in the game, on the 1-yard line, tried to punch it in, wasn't able to score a touchdown. Could have very easily had himself 15 plus fantasy points within the given week based on his overall opportunities, just wasn't able to capitalize on it. Jake Ferguson was a decent overall play, was the number 9 overall tight end. We'll take that victory. Darrell Henderson was the number 22 overall running back, scored 10 fantasy points. We'll take that as well. Blake Grupe was a top 12 tight end, so we'll take that. Outside of the injury and the 2 dud plays of the Houston Texans, a decent overall week from our week 8 hidden gems. Now that we've gone ahead and reviewed that, let's go ahead and let's transition into putting together a couple pick'em slips via Underdog Fantasy and closing out today's episode. Now, besides the Lamar Jackson 0.5 total yards to new customer signups, using code Andrew, making that first time deposit minimum of $10, you can also take advantage of the sweepstakes of a $100K via Jonathan Taylor. As of this week, it's a $5 maximum entry, so you have to put them in within a pick'em slip, and you have an opportunity of 10,000 people winning $10. So again, you could potentially double your money just off of making it, an overall play. You don't even have to win, but if you win, even better. Either way, let's go ahead and let's talk about some of the overall plays that I wanted to, kind of show you guys going into the given week. First and foremost, I wanted to take advantage of the opportunity of Drake London's absence. What I saw earlier today was that Kyle Pitts, his number in terms of receptions was relatively low. So let's go ahead. Man, there is a lot of plays. Did I skip Kyle Pitts already? If I haven't already, I think I may have. Okay, here we go. Kyle Pitts, 3.5 receptions in the absence of Drake London, my expectation would be that Kyle Pitts would be the number one receiving option. Taking on the Minnesota Vikings, I understand they've got a really solid defense as of right now, but my expectation would be that he could very easily surpass 3.5 receptions. That is not a difficult number to, be able to clear, especially considering the change of quarterback and far more efficient passing from a guy like Taylor Heineke in comparison to what we have seen from Desmond Ridder over his career. So I like Kyle Pitts a lot in this overall scenario. Now, another player that I like a lot is in regards to the Carolina Panthers wide receiver, Adam Thielen. Adam Thielen, 69.5 receiving yards. I'll take higher on that going into this week, primarily because he's been able to accomplish higher on this overall number in 5 of the last 5 games. He's on a hot streak, and as long as he continues to turn out great performances, going up against Kenny Moore, one of these slot cornerbacks who hasn't played well thus far this season, Adam Thielen should very easily be able to surpass 70 receiving yards in my mind. Now, going back to the tight end conversation, I wanted to go ahead and mention Dalton Kincaid. So let's go ahead. Let's find Dalton Kincaid. He plays on Sunday Night Football against the Cincinnati Bengals. The best matchup at the, tight end position. So my expectation would be, I already skipped him. My expectation would be that very easily Dalton Kincaid should have himself 38.5 receiving yards. That is not a number that he should be able to kind of worry about. He's been able to have himself, 65 and 75 receiving yards in each of the last 2 games. When we talk about tight end receiving statistics against this team, George Kittle had 149 receiving yards last week against the Bengals. The Arizona Cardinals tight ends, which there were 3 of them who caught 2 passes in the last time in which they took on the Cincinnati Bengals, they combined for 49 receiving yards. Tyler Higbee had 71 receiving yards. Mark Andrews had 45 receiving yards. I think 38.5 receiving yards is a very easily accomplishable number going into the week. The final player I wanted to mention is in regards to Monday Night Football, a player that, as of right now, has one of the best opportunities going into the given week. It's Garrett Wilson taking on the Los Angeles Chargers defense, one of the best matchups of the position. My expectation would be that with 65.5 receiving yards, having been able to accomplish 90 plus receiving yards in each of the last 2 games, 12 plus targets in 3 of the last 4 games, and on top of it, the matchup itself, my expectation would be Garrett Wilson should very easily be able to surpass this overall number. Those are the 4 plays that I like. Again, yesterday's overall play of Derrick Henry and Deontay Johnson hit for us. As you guys can see to the right side of the screen, we're back onto the board. We're able to go ahead and clear both those numbers. Very, very close to not clearing that number with Derrick Henry. But nonetheless, we're able to clear both those numbers and get ourselves back on track in regards to, these overall pick'em slips. My suggestion typically is to put together slips of 2 players. So both the tight ends or Thielen and Kincaid. Those are probably my 2 favorites within the given week. If I was making a suggestion to you, it would be, Adam Thielen, Dalton Kincaid, both of them going higher on their receiving yards. Those are the 2 better plays of the overall given week, and just letting that ride going into this week. All right, thank you everybody for watching. Again, be sure to use code Andrew via Underdog Fantasy. I'll be back tomorrow afternoon, live streaming Sunday morning at 6 a.m. Pacific Standard Time, so be sure to swing on by. Thank you everybody for watching, and until next time, I'll see you guys. Peace.